In Arizona's southern county of Santa Cruz, you will find the city of Nogales. At first glance, an average American city with a population of slightly over 20,000. Most of these are families of which the median income lies at almost $30,000 a year. The average age is 34, and despite the many problems of the American healthcare system, the population is healthy. There's a low child mortality rate, cost of health insurance is low compared to the American average, and residents of Nogales are healthier than the American average. Unemployment lies at 7%, 29% of the population have a high school degree, 35% have college degrees, and 32% have not finished high school. The majority of the educated population is younger than 44, and education levels are steadily increasing by generation. What makes Nogales stand out in the American average is that the median income is half of the American average and that poverty rates are twice as high as the American average, with a population in poverty of 30%. With this, Nogales lies beneath the Arizona average, but still does considerably better than many towns in other US states. Most working people are employed in construction, retail, and transportation. Founding a business in Nogales is easy and can be done without having to pay bribes or fear of being unnecessarily obstructed by the government or organized crime. The city, in fact, provides a handy guide through all the steps required on its homepage, intent to attract more business. Several of the residents founded businesses and bigger American corporations settled offshoots in the city. The crime rate is low, violent crimes are rare, some crimes are non-existent, and overall the crime rates of Nogales, despite occasional brief increases, are lower than the state average and the national average. The people of Nogales also have a say in the political matters of their community, state, and country. They elect a mayor and a city council that is accountable to them and can be legally removed for transgressions or electorally removed should there be disapproval. The same can be said of their state senator elected through the 2nd Senate District, the governor, and the federal representatives. They are part of the 3rd Congressional District of Arizona with an elected congressman accountable to them, as well as a senator. All in all, political representatives tasked with providing the basic infrastructure and services a community needs to prosper, who will be voted out if they fail at that task. Nogales is by all standards just another average American city, with average Americans living their average American lives. But there is one thing which makes this place very special. Take a walk from the McDonald's down Crawford Street, take the right down Arroyo Boulevard, and you might end up at the La Roja Bar, which is in Nogales, in the state of Sonora, in Mexico. Nogales used to be one town founded by a cattle rancher family in 1841. 10 years later, the Americans bought large parts of desert borderlands from Mexico, and the line drawn by that Gadsden purchase split the town in two. The average median income in this Nogales is $10,000, a third of that just a few feet away. The percentage of people with college degrees lies at 18%. The majority of the population don't even have high school education. Educational standards are so low that there is a local phenomenon of residents signing their children up in high schools in the other Nogales, resulting in a daily walk to school across the border for many kids. Housing conditions are bad. Some people live in shacks that lack basic commodities and infrastructure. In large parts of the town, drinking water is contaminated by sewage, garbage, and occasionally by industrial discharge. The child mortality rate is high. There's a considerably lower average lifespan and life expectancy. Roads, highways, sewers, and other basic infrastructure are barely maintained and constantly broken. Many residents are forced to scramble together and build their own basic infrastructure, such as access to water, electricity, or sewage systems by themselves, as both the federal and local government fail to provide basic services. The crime rate is high. There are between 2 to 3 murders a week, 3 to 4 kidnappings a week. Many local businesses are fronts run by organized crime. Using public transportation or taxis is an invitation to getting robbed. Calling the police for help might result in a considerable wait due to the police being understaffed throughout the state due to targeted assassinations of police officers who refuse to take bribes by organized crime, resulting in fewer people being willing to take such a life-threatening job. To top all that off, saying that the police has a corruption problem is putting it mildly. The state in general is known to have one of the highest rates of domestic violence and violence against women in the country. The current governor of the state was elected after her predecessor fled into the underground due to a massive manhunt and international investigation for bribery, extortion, racketeering, and corruption. She is a member of the PRI, a corrupt party that, in collaboration with oligarchs and organized crime, ruled Mexico as a one-party state for almost a century. Her predecessor ran for a party promising to end that corruption, but that party turned out to be just as corrupt. And if you want to open a business in Nogales, you will have to bribe either the local corrupt politician, criminal gang, dirty cop, or even all three of them for that privilege, and they might still choose to rob you anyway. And with all of this combined, keep in mind that Nogales, on average, has a lower crime rate, lower police corruption, higher average education, and higher standard of living than the Mexican average. Ironically, the only thing better in the Mexican Nogales compared to the American Nogales is the quality of healthcare, as the thousands of annual American healthcare tourists can probably attest to. So, why are the two Nogales so different? What is it that makes these two places that are only a few feet apart so vastly separate in everything else? Well, why are some places poor and some places wealthy? This is a question that many have even more different answers to, and Nogales is a great place to find an answer. It isn't geography or climate, as the geographic determinist may claim, because both Nogales share the same geography and climate. It is not big business, capitalism, or socialism, as both cities have the same class structure and market system. It isn't ethnicity, culture, religion, demographics, or as some dumber people may even claim, race, because both Nogales are majority Catholic, share similar demographics, and the population of the American Nogales is 95% of what Americans call Latinos. When you boil everything down to basics, there is in the end only one single thing separating the two Nogales: a border. This is a story about the creation of state and economic institutions, the failure of these institutions, and how the legacy of failed institutions impact your life. When Christopher Columbus landed in what he thought was India, but what we now know was Hispaniola, he encountered the native peoples of the Arawak. Returning to Spain, he reported to the king that the Arawak
are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with everyone.
Columbus came from a Europe of war and conquest in which the idea of sharing is caring didn't make much sense. So he concluded in his report to the king that if he got enough money to sail there again, he would return with
as much gold as they want, and as many slaves as they ask.
And hereby, the tone was set for the first mode of operation for the first Spanish colonists in the Americas. Sail over there, enslave the natives, bring these slaves home and sell them. However, upon returning to the Caribbean, this plan didn't work. Of the 500 enslaved Arawak that he tried to return to Spain, 200 died, and the remaining were so weak they could not be sold for the fortunes that he had promised. So he had to make good on the second promise of bringing the gold, and created the second mode of operation for colonists. He returned to Chichau in what is now Haiti, enslaved all the Arawak he could find, and forced them to dig in hastily built mines in the mountains for any scrap of gold dust that they could find. The task made no economic, ethical, or even just basic sense. There was barely any gold in Hispaniola, yet the Spaniards would brutally punish the Arawak for not finding any of the gold that didn't even exist in the first place. The result was rebellion, massacre, and genocide. Within 2 years of the 250,000 Arawak, half were dead. Columbus fell out of grace with the crown, but the conquistadors had learned the new blueprint for what they would do in the Spanish Caribbean. Instead of digging for gold that didn't exist, they enslaved the natives and forced them to grow sugar and coffee on Caribbean plantations starting in 1515. However, with this they encountered a new problem by 1550, when of the 250,000 Arawak, only 500 were left. They kept dying. The brutality and indignity of the slave plantations and the extreme disruptions to their lives killed them. So they had to be replaced at cost through slaves, kidnapped and shipped in from Africa by the Portuguese. The third mode of operating a colony was thereby born: slave plantations with imported slaves from Africa. It would spread throughout the Spanish Caribbean and be copied throughout British, French, Dutch and Portuguese colonies throughout the region. But as the Spanish ventured further into the Americas, they found another mode of operating a colony, a means of building a society that would fundamentally shape much of Latin American social, economic, and political structures to this very day. In 1519, Hernán Cortés ventured into the highlands of Mexico and found something that the Spaniards had been looking for a very long time. A settled civilization. The Aztecs did not only have a state, taxation system, division of labor, bureaucracy and empire. They had a state structure with castes, from king to clergy to warrior to peasants, that formed the foundation for the institutions of their state to function. And that state was a feudal state, with an unquestionable set of god kings, who were in their power absolute and unchallengeable. Here, Cortés would do what had worked in feudal Europe for centuries before. If you wanted to conquer a king, kill the king, take his throne, seize control of the state. Now, you are the king and the state is yours. The Aztec emperor, Montezuma, was kidnapped and murdered. Cortés took his place, installed himself as the new absolute ruler, and acquired the wealth of the state as well as the absolute power of its feudal institutions. And although these conquistadors did not become kings in name, they created a class of colonial elites that pretty much had the power of absolute kings, by taking over from the previous kings and acquiring the authority of their state institutions. The wider system throughout the Spanish Americas became known as the encomienda, which means commission. The conquistadors conquered a people, and then these people and the land were assigned as an encomienda to the individual conquistadors, who then owned the land and the people on it within a feudal structure. This structure remained in place until the 1820s and was further expanded through the import of African slaves and Spanish settlers. An additional development within Spanish American society was the development of the cacique, which comes from the Arawak word casequa, meaning tribal chief. Cacique today is more associated with the term small tyrant. It was used to describe subordinate Native American chieftains who entered Spanish society to retain their social status. These caciques would then, similar to conquistadors, rule as small tyrants over stretches of land and the people within it, to exploit them for their own benefits and for the Spanish crown. As a result, society was expanded not just in numbers, but in structure by la casta. When European settlers arrived, the conquistadors developed into a social elite that didn't wish to share its power. The result was a class and racially mixed feudal social hierarchy. Nobles born in Spain stood at the top, followed by nobles born in the New World, followed by poor whites born in Spain, followed by poor whites born in the Americas, followed by people of mixed race, followed by Indios, followed by freed slaves, and at the bottom lay the slaves. A rigid, authoritarian and strictly hierarchical society with stipulations in place that limited any social mobility. This socio-economic structure would remain in place throughout the Spanish Americas for centuries, and to some extent still to this very day. The fundamental purpose of it would remain to enrich the motherland of Spain. Only raw materials were produced in plantations and mines, brought to the harbors to be exported to Spain, where they would be used to manufacture products that were shipped back to be sold to the colonies, thereby creating an economic system of dependencies. There was no economic specialization, plurality into other sectors, or further innovation. Worse still, it disconnected and disintegrated the Spanish colonies economically. Before the Spaniards, there had been an indigenous trade network stretching almost the entire continent. With the arrival of the Spanish, the colonies didn't trade amongst themselves, creating even further dependency on outsiders, making Spanish America an economy dependent on foreign markets for its produce and raw materials. And since the owners of the plantations and mines were Spanish nobles, often born and raised in Spain and detached from this land and its people, it started a sort of economic custom of foreign ownership of the economic structures of the region. A business culture in which these elites, who were the owners of economic assets, acted with impunity and complete disregard for those who they considered to be beneath them and almost foreign, even though they were in their land. They would control these populations with draconian punishments, with a foreign Spanish army forbidding the ownership of firearms and banning free movement and commerce, laws which were enforced through the iron fist of one of the most powerful entities in human history, the Spanish Empire. This situation also raised an increasing resentment amongst the wealthy elites, despite all the benefits they had. These only produced raw materials, had to sell to Spain, could not trade with outsiders, and could not expand into and develop other economic sectors with their raw materials. We will see where this would lead to later. Meanwhile, in Europe, there was a lot of envy and spite. Through getting a head start, the Spanish and Portuguese had gotten the best parts of the New World. The most valuable slave plantation economies of Cuba and Hispaniola had gone to the Spanish, as well as the silver mines of Potosi. The Portuguese seized control of the Atlantic slave trade, and the French, English, and Dutch were left with scraps for their own slave plantations. Consequently, their early efforts focused around seizing the enormous profits of the Caribbean slave economies for themselves through piracy against the Spanish, grabbing whatever was left in the Caribbean and taking Spanish slave plantations by force. The lands in North America were left untouched for almost a century. Early Spanish settlers quickly realized that the output of plantations in the north were only an eighth of the output in the Caribbean. The north was seen as inhospitable, uneconomical, and wild. But it was the only thing left to grab, so by the 1600s the English tried and failed at Roanoke. So they tried again in 1607. Sent by the Virginia Company, these settlers landed in the lands of the Powhatan, in what we now know as Virginia, and founded a place called Jamestown. In popular history, these early colonists are described as utopian settlers who wish to build and farm a new society. And that is simply not true. The colonists had arrived with weapons and goldsmiths, intent to do as Cortés and Pizarro had done, kidnap the Indian king, seize control of his kingdom, and melt down the gold. However, when they invited the Indian king Wahahunsunakok to an English crowning ceremony at which they had intended to kidnap him, his response literally was,
"I shall not take such bait."
He then enforced a blockade of Jamestown. The colonists had hoped that the Indians would actually feed them after they had killed and replaced their king, as Cortés had done with the Aztecs. So they had not brought anyone who knew how to grow crops, cure meat, or even how to hunt or fish. So they starved, including all the goldsmiths, and resorted to cannibalism. Indian societies of North America were different from those in the South and Central America. The population density in pre-colonial America was lower in the north, and the peoples were organized in semi-nomadic and loosely connected confederations. There were not the masses of people to enslave, farms and plantations to conquer, gold to steal, silver to mine, and sugar to grow as in the South. But above all, there were no state structures and institutions to take over. The Indians of North America, by and large, lived in stateless societies. The Spanish model of colonization simply couldn't work here. James Smith, a mercenary captain on the governing council of Jamestown, realized first that the South American colonial model would not work here. He wrote to the Virginia Company to send gardeners, farmers, fishermen, and artisans, and since the Virginia Company had made no profits in the colony's 2 years of existence, they decided to implement a radical change. The colony would no longer be run by a council. Instead, it would be run by an all-powerful governor who implemented a forced labor system amongst European colonists and imported penal labor. The laws of the colony, known as the laws divine, moral, and martial, punished with death the leaving of the colony, the mingling with Indians, and the theft of food. It also punished with death the sale and trading of any commodities and produce made by the colonists amongst themselves, or to anyone except the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company couldn't enslave and exploit the Indians, so it tried to exploit colonists, in barracks with assigned food rations and with governor-ordered work details. They were to grow produce, hunt for pelts, and produce timber, which they would hand over to the company governor to be shipped back and sold for company profit. However, this also didn't work. Who the Virginia Company sent to be forced labor were people who were no longer welcome in England, sometimes just pickpockets and drunkards picked from the rabble of 1600s London. People who had little respect for the authority of the English state, let alone some English company, and in this place the English monarchy had even less authority. The imported labourers simply started running away, beyond company control, into the Virginia frontier. They built their own farms, their own outposts, their own trade networks, and they formed their own militias. Instead of labourers, they became settlers. Unlike Spain, neither England nor the Virginia Company had the means to enforce their order. So, the tried and tested colonial order of forced labour under colonial elite collapsed. The Virginia Company needed a different approach, which they enacted in 1619. They noticed that settlers working their own land produced more and worked harder than forced labor. So from now on, the Virginia Company imported people as settlers and not as forced laborers. To sign a contract, according to which, in exchange for years spent in indentured servitude, every settler was given 50 acres of land by the company, and 50 acres more for every family member a settler would bring. A general assembly was introduced, the members of which were voted on by every landowning man, which functioned as a counterweight to the company governor. The settlers could still only sell their products and produce to the Virginia Company, but the company, and by that extent the Crown, could not simply force their will upon the colonists. They had to govern through negotiation, concession, and ultimately pragmatism. Though Virginia would largely remain feudal, the governance structure that developed was one dependent on cooperation with the masses. In 1632, the Crown tried itself without the company, when King Charles I gifted 10 million acres of land around the Chesapeake Bay to Cecilus Calvert, the second Baron of Baltimore, who founded a town at the bay and named his lands Maryland after the king's wife. They intended to create a society of plots of land owned by nobles shaped after the English aristocracy, with serfs to work and serve. And just as in Virginia, it all failed. There was so much land that if you didn't like being a serf in the lands you were assigned to, you could just move to other land. And Lord Baltimore didn't have the means to evict settlers from the enormous 10 million acres of land he claimed to own. Baltimore had to provide incentives for settlers, such as a say in government. Therefore, an assembly was introduced in Maryland which voted to become a colony of the king, thereby removing Lord Baltimore of all power in Baltimore. In New England, a different type of settler arrived. English Puritans, who specifically came to build a new utopian society detached from all the legal and state frameworks of the society they left behind. A kingdom of God, in which religious norms and communal values were enforced to keep peace in a virtuous and very intolerant society. Trade with any English companies was a secondary issue to them. What mattered to them was the construction of their new and self-sufficient society. Their communal values had priority over not just individual liberties, but also the values and laws of the English crown. And these settlers would resist attempts of total control over them by England more than any other colonists. In Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the surrounding Midlands, Quakers, Mennonites, and other persecuted Protestant minorities of England, Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia settled to build a pacifist society of self-sufficient small farmers, people who wanted to be left alone and to themselves with as little interference by any authority. In the South, English Caribbean slave plantation owners expanded into the Carolinas and Georgia for more land, for more plantations to import more slaves into. These settlers saw themselves as the descendants of Norman English aristocracy, which they weren't, and they would build a brutal slave society on a foundation of cruelty and profit. These settlers may have professed loyalty to Britain, but their main loyalty, first and foremost, was to their bottom line. They implemented their own brutal social system built upon controlling a slave society with ruthless violence, systematic oppression, and cruelty, and they would resist anyone who challenged that socio-economic framework. While the Appalachians were settled by Scottish Presbyterians from the Scottish borderlands and highlands, a people organized in clan and family structures who couldn't give any less of a damn about what an English crown that they had spent centuries rebelling against told them to do. They purposefully sought out the hard-to-reach borderlands of the colonies in the Appalachian mountains and forests. to be as far away as possible from any English authority and to live their lives as they saw fit. The social and economic structures that developed were entirely different from those in South America. Spanish-American society was dominated by an aristocracy ruling over serfs. Spanish colonies didn't trade with each other and only exported to and imported from Spain, and that Spain enforced its rule through blunt military force. In the English North American colonies, the colonies traded with each other, specialized and even started manufacturing themselves, built their own cultural, social and economic structures which were increasingly independent from Britain. A society of landowners developed who had an ever-increasing say in how they were governed. Instead of being exploited by lords, these landlords imported slaves to exploit themselves, or worked the land themselves for themselves, which is a story deserving of its own video. And far distant Britain could only maintain sovereignty and rule over these colonies through negotiation and concession, and as it would soon find out, not through brutal force. Two very different social structures started to develop in the New World. And as much as some know-nothing English twats with very posh English accents may tell you that American society developed out of old English customs and traditions of monarchy, the reality is that it by and large evolved out of a rebellion against these things. But how did these societies develop so differently, and why does it matter? While the English colonies started taking shape, a civil war raged in England, and during its chaos an Englishman called Thomas Hobbes wrote a book about what he believed a state should be, called Leviathan, from which we know that he would have disapproved of what was happening in the English colonies, and would have preferred what happened in the Spanish Americas. The Leviathan is an enormous biblical sea monster before which all human efforts to resist and fight are futile. And in Hobbes' mind, this is what the ideal state ought to resemble, a powerful force of nature, resistance against which was to be futile. If all bowed before and contributed to the establishment of a powerful state, that state would in return secure the well-being of all who were part of it. That through a collective effort, a collective good and security could be assured, and also above all, hold at bay what Hobbes saw as the only alternative to the Leviathan, anarchy and statelessness, or as Hobbes put it, warr, and described as
continual fear and anger of violent death, and the life of a man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
The actual terror of anarchy or stateless societies or warr or whatever you wish to call it, according to Hobbes, however, does not come from a continuous violence of masses of all against all, but
consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary.
And a lack of structure to provide
the passions that incline men to peace, of fear of death, desire of such things as a necessity to commodious living, and a hope that their industry will obtain them.
Statelessness, in Hobbes' view, could neither provide security for one's safety, nor the security and stability for industry, labor, and commerce to exist and prosper. What Hobbes proposed in its stead was a commonwealth, state, or great Leviathan, a collective good and order, that all would render themselves under its authority and would bring prosperity and security to all. Hobbes, however, was wrong. The great Leviathan state under whose authority all shall render themselves turned out to be amongst one of the most horrific monsters ever to be inflicted upon mankind. Order within itself is no guarantor for a universal common good. A powerful state with an efficient bureaucracy can just as well use that bureaucracy to create lists of people to be deported into death camps, to facilitate depriving a region of basic food supplies and thereby intentionally starve millions, or create a society of surveillance and mass policing in which nobody is safe from the Leviathan itself. Power is in itself not an inherent good, neither is being a state an inherent good, let alone are these guarantors of social and economic success. A society of laws is only worth as much as its laws are worth, and the Leviathan that was the Spanish Empire provided little prosperity or economic success for its population or security. But more importantly, Hobbes was wrong about stateless societies. Stateless societies can exist and provide both the security and stability for people to prosper and live. The first communities of humans probably started out as family structures amongst hunter-gatherers. These would then band together with other families to form bands. When those bands settled during the agricultural revolution, they stopped traveling vast stretches of land, stayed put in one place, developed myths and religions around the landmarks and personalities of the place, invented stories in both identifying and religious terms to explain their own existence, developed unique cultural expressions, and through this formed into tribes. In these settled tribes, the self-sufficiency of the hunter-gatherer was abandoned. A segmented social structure developed in which each and everyone was dependent upon the other, and each segment of society was a replica of another segment. The fabric that holds these societies together is family and social norms, traditions, and religions. Such societies are frequently romanticized as anarchist utopias, as places of freedom, solidarity, and individualism, places in which terms such as prosperity are meaningless as all prosper together with the group or alone through themselves and their own labor. But are they? The New World colonies of England were societies removed from the authority of the English state, societies of norms, traditions, and religion. And what were these norms, traditions, and religious dictates? Puritan New England was a deeply intolerant society, a place where Quakers had their noses cut open, ears sliced off, and the face branded with the letter H for heretic, so they could be easily identified if they dare return to their community. A place where communal judges handed out the death penalty for adultery, blasphemy, idolatry, and sodomy. A place where Captain Thomas Kemble was put in the stocks because after returning from a 3-year voyage he had publicly kissed his wife. In Virginia, the norms and dictates were those of the landed gentry and transplant aristocracy, a place where the punishment for insulting such an aristocrat was to receive 50 beatings by 20 men, have your tongue drilled through, a fine worth 10 years of a farmer's income, followed by being banned for life from Virginia. In the mountains of Appalachia, the norms that dictated life were those of family clans, feuding and fighting over scraps of land and livestock, with maimings, killings, and subsequent retaliatory actions in a cycle of continuous self-propelling violence. And in the Deep South, the social norms dictated that the black man was a subhuman, that the black woman had no right to defend herself against the violations of her body by a white master, that it was the white man who has to be both the owner, superior, and master of all black men, because it has always been that way, because the Bible says so, and because that is simply the norm and tradition of the white man's civilization, a place where it was the norm that a cruel and horrendous fate befell black men unfortunate enough to be accused of even just looking at a white woman the wrong way. A stateless society is a society of social norms and/or a society of God. It therefore can be and is more than likely a society in which the most fanatical dictate what these norms are, be it in the name of King Jesus or under Sharia. It can also be a tyranny of cousins in which arbitrary notions of family honor frame your life's purpose and limitations. It can be a society in which what the norms are is dictated by the whip hand and the bloodhound. In short, a society in which what the norms are is dictated by those with the bigger guns. And it can be the society of the tribal chief, whose whims and neuroses dictate everyone's life. Therefore, a stateless society can be every bit as tyrannical, as horrendous, and as cruel as any Leviathan. A society of fanatics, violence, and slave owners that requires every bit of obedience. While watching, you may have started thinking over how this is almost a metaphor for interactions on social media, where rules are vaguely defined and the resulting norms are dictated by those who can scream for cancelling the loudest. Or is it the other way around, that social media companies are domineering dangerous leviathans in whom we invest too much trust? And please, if you do, hang on to that metaphor, because what I present here is not a binary. State and stateless entities are known to coexist, to cooperate, but also to compete with each other. The story of the United States is the story of a loose confederation of semi-stateless entities that struggled over centuries to unify and evolve from being societies of norms into a singular society of laws. A leviathan, if you will, but a leviathan in competition, conflict, and cooperation with its internal, disparate groups of semi-stateless entities of norms. However, more relevant for us is the story of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which, as this video will show, is the story of a collapsing leviathan. Our common high school history curriculum teaches us that the first Europeans to settle North America were those pioneers and pilgrims who landed in Virginia and New England. The framing of that story is within itself not true, but more importantly, it is overall factually not true. In the first decades of the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors had explored the plains of Kansas, trekked up the Colorado River and through the Grand Canyon, sailed up the coast of Nova Scotia, mapped the Pacific coast from California through Oregon to British Columbia, and ascended the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, a century before French, Dutch, and English settlers even arrived on the eastern coastlines of North America. In 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine in Florida, which is the oldest European town in the United States. The oldest building within the continental United States is the Governor's Palace in Santa Fe, built by the Spanish in 1610. The oldest building within the borders of the United States is the San Juan Cathedral in Puerto Rico, built in 1521. From 1560 onward, the Spaniards pushed north of Monterrey to found Santa Fe and Taos in New Mexico, pushed east to found Nacogdoches, and pushed west to the Bay of San Francisco. The claims laid to the lands of North America were vast. You will find the occasional Spanish enclave lasting to this very day, such as in Colorado and New Mexico, communities who still practice old medieval Spanish customs, such as symbolically crucifying a member of the community during Lent, communities that define themselves not as Mexican but as Spanish American, older than Mexican American communities and the Mexican identity itself, and fiercely defensive and protective of their 500-year-old Spanish heritage. But Spanish culture north of Zacatecas developed differently from the rest of the colony. Mexico, or New Spain as it was known then, was the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire. It produced 2/3 of the empire's revenue. It was the most populous as well as the richest part of the empire. It was the administrative center of all of Central America, North and South America, and the Spanish Caribbean, which created a strong governmental structure in its capital. Silver mines, as well as large sectors of agriculture and ranching, created an economy and class of wealthy merchants, which built a society that was wealthier than any other Spanish colony, English colony, French colony, and by the 1700s, even wealthier than the Spanish homeland itself. This wealth was hardly surprising. If you look at the wealth of the pre-colonial Americas, it is also the natives who lived in this stretch of land who were the wealthiest. The Spanish took over that society, expanded it, and prospered from it. But to the north of Zacatecas, the environment, climate, geography, and society changes. The Sierra Madre Mountains, which push out into fertile plateaus in the south, in the north stretch out into the dry Mexican highlands known as the Chaparral, surrounded by dry lands and the North American desert. These lands are dry, with few rainfalls during the summer, the complete opposite of the lush tropical climate zones and jungles of southern Mexico. Mexico is a north-south divided country in geography, but also in society. Southern and central Mexico's native populations were settled city-state civilizations, such as the Aztecs, but go north and the arid land made this type of settlement and social organization difficult. Here lived the Guayahiltecan and the Apaches, semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples who had adapted their society perfectly to the land they lived in. And along the Colorado River you found the Pueblo, a settled peoples who lived in towns and villages of up to 5-story high buildings, growing peach groves and trading in textiles, also fiercely independent. When Spain arrived, it was easier to take over the state structures of the south than take the north. Especially the Apaches and Pueblo resisted fiercely. These were not people who could simply be subjugated and assimilated through conquest and the usurpation of their leaderships. They lived in these vast lands, which include the modern-day states of Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Coahuila. And forget the modern borders. See this as a geographic landscape, shaped by dry plains, plateaus, deserts, and occasional rivers. A rough land that required a rough and specialized society to live in. The Aztecs may have been a society of laws, clergy, nobles, serfs, taxes, and bureaucracy, but those who lived here were a society of norms, traditions, families, and autonomy. And the Spaniards chewed their teeth out on them. When the story of the Indian is told, our modern perception is dominated by a narrative of tragedy that ignores their perseverance and victories there were. Many don't know that in the wars between natives and settlers, the Spaniards were defeated in these lands. In 1680, after the Spanish colonial authorities burnt Pueblo shamans on the stake for heresy and resisting the Catholic faith, the Pueblo assembled an army and kicked the Spanish army out of Santa Fe and New Mexico. The Spanish army may have been a modern and terrifying entity on the battlefields of Europe, but here in these vast borderlands, facing guerrilla tactics by an enemy who knew the land like their back pocket, they were hopelessly outmatched. Especially the Apaches would not leave the Spanish even a bit of respite, burning mines and ranches alike. The Apaches, in fact, would keep fighting for centuries against the Spaniards, Mexicans, Texans, Confederates, and Americans alike, and be the last native Indians to surrender in 1924. The authority of the Spanish state never really established itself here, and it never really stood a chance in the first place. So what developed in its stead here in the north was very different. The Spanish called native people gente sin razón, meaning people without reason. But unlike other colonial powers, the Spanish believed that they could be turned into gente de razón. And here in the north, they would try with a different mode of colonization after the first one had failed. For this purpose, the Spanish established missions, usually run by Jesuit Catholic priests. The Indians would be confined to these missions where they would have to convert to Catholicism, work in tanneries, mines, workshops, stables, or kilns, and speak Spanish only under the threat of severe punishment. The native Indians would be called neophytes during their time in the mission, and the plan was for the priests to civilize and turn them into God-fearing Catholics loyal to Spain and then release them. However, the priests who ran these missions made considerable profit with their unpaid workforce, which consequently provided an incentive to never actually declare any of the Indians brutalized in the missions to be civilized. 18 such missions existed in New Mexico, 20 in Texas, 8 in Arizona, and 21 in Alta California. And French explorers who visited such a mission described them as
everything reminded us of a Caribbean slave colony. We mention this in pain because the resemblance is so perfect that we saw men and women loaded with irons, others in stocks, and at length the noise of the strokes of a whip struck our ears.
These missions would form the modern towns of Tucson, San Antonio, San Diego, and San Francisco. The natives in essence were slaves. Many consequently ran away. Many more died under the brutish conditions, and the Spaniards had to import more Spanish settlers to continue operations. Consequently, this new mode of colonization also failed. These Spanish settlers were supposed to live under the same strict rules and regulations as were in place throughout colonial Spain. Spanish settlers in Texas were forbidden from trading their goods with other colonial states, even other Spanish colonies like Cuba or California, or to even ship them from their own Gulf Coast. Instead, they were supposed to ship their cattle hides down cobbled roads to Mexico City, from which they were then sold back to Spain. A restrictive and highly regulated economic model intent on stifling any economic self-sufficiency that could rival that of the Spanish crown. But it increasingly didn't work. Spanish settlers simply left those towns, built their own ranches and farms, and up here in the north, the Spanish state was simply not strong enough to stop them. These independent and self-sufficient ranchers tracked along the Gulf Coast into the French colony of Louisiana to trade their cattle and leather with the French merchants of New Orleans. They would even sell them along the coast to British and Dutch traders in open defiance of the Spanish state and its laws against local independent commerce. Just as with the English companies in Virginia and English aristocrats in the Chesapeake Bay, the colonial mode of operation of conquest, subjugation, and forced labor simply didn't work in the northern fringes of New Spain from Texas to California. The Spanish had to provide incentives for the cooperation of their subjects. They did so by offering payment in exchange for labor in mines and workshops. This created a wage-based labor economy that spread south from the north and gradually started replacing the feudal economic order of serfs and their masters. In the south, this created an increasingly wealthy class of merchants, while in the north, separate political orders and social structures started to evolve. In the absence of the Spanish state, people started organizing in disparate communal structures, usually with the wealthiest member of the community being at the top. That person, usually the owner of the largest ranch or mine, would become the benefactor of the community, organize festivities, provide charity, and settle disputes. The term used to describe and address these individuals became patron. A divide started to develop between a south with its densely populated core, the seat of the government and center of administration, and the north, on the periphery, its society more decentralized and self-sufficient. A divide that in many ways continues to this day and is frequently ignored by outsiders. A society of peoples who were distant from the bishops, governors, and tax collectors of southern New Spain, and Spain itself. Where people married without the approval of Catholic ceremony or a priest, where different decentralized religious practices evolved, distant from Catholic doctrine. A society that became majority white Spanish settlers in contrast to the large mestizo population in the south. A society with a deep distrust of centralized state structures, authority, and government, in which the family and its values and traditions mattered more. The North would significantly shape Mexican but also American society. This is the place where the Wild West, as we know it in popular culture, was actually born, and not in the United States. It was here where the first cowboys, called vaqueros, led cattle herds on trails to markets both south and north. Their language permeated across cultures to be found within Spanish loanwords in the English language, into which they were adopted when American settlers started moving west 100 years later and encountered them. Lazo, la riata, chaparreras, rodeo, vaquero, mesteño, bandolera, estampida, and rancho. The Americans merely adopted the frontier. Mexico was born in it, molded by it. It didn't leave the frontier until it became annexed. It is really hard to tell why revolutions happen, even more so retrospectively. Most people who claim to know are motivated by their own desired outcomes. For one, there is never such a thing as just one reason. A Tunisian fruit vendor may set himself ablaze in protest, but the reason this incident became a spark that lit a revolution had been decades of economic mismanagement, corruption, police brutality, state repression, a political leadership that was both out of touch and arrogant, a disaffected youth, unemployment, foreign education, the free spreading of information through the internet, and the list goes on. The same is very much true here. I could spend an hour talking about why the Spanish colony of New Spain became Mexico, but I won't. I am pointing this out though because I don't want you to believe that the reasons I list in this short video are the only ones. When Spain built its American empire, its first and foremost interest was gold and silver, and that is what it got out of the colonies. Later, it would add sugar and tobacco to the list of imports from its colonies in the Caribbean, but everything else was mostly left behind. Economies around other products, from leather to meat to wood to all the other basic commodities and raw materials that you can think of, consequently started to develop. And it was those economies that contributed to a substantial growth of wealth in the colony of New Spain. To such an extent, in fact, that New Spain eventually became wealthier than Spain itself. And that was eyed with increasing envy by Spain, who, when the Bourbons became kings in the 1700s, started implementing taxes and regulations to get its own share of that cake. It sent companies such as the Guipuzcoan Trading Company to the New World to seize control of these independently evolving markets. This is when the first murmurs and desires for independence began in the Spanish Americas, from Argentina to Peru, Colombia to Mexico. The wealthy class of traders and the newly formed social elites didn't like giving up control over their revenue. Unlike in the British Americas, Enlightenment values and philosophies didn't play as much of a role in the American autonomy struggles. Most revolutionaries were part of social elites who wished to first and foremost keep their social status and power, and their conflict with Spain originated from that desire. One thing is certain, the spark that lit the fuse to revolution happened here in Europe, when Napoleon invaded and occupied Spain. Spain then allied itself with Napoleon. This resulted in a British blockade of Spanish trade on the oceans, which severely hurt the bottom line of the Spanish-American elites and consequently angered them. Adding to that, the pro-Napoleonic Spanish government favored the abolition of slavery and end to indentured servitude. The tunes of liberty that were sung by France, and consequently in a Spain allied with France, were something that deeply worried the Spanish-American elites. In 1805, the British sank both the French and Spanish fleets in Trafalgar, greatly diminishing Spanish naval power and subsequently its ability to connect and to police its American colonies. Then in 1806, the British invaded the Rio de Plata in modern-day Uruguay and Argentina, where they were defeated not by a Spanish but local armies and militias. That event showed the Spanish Americans that they were capable of building an efficient and well-commanded military force by themselves without the Spanish, and that they were even capable of defeating a powerful nation. Then, Spain had enough of France, rebelled and sided with Britain against Napoleon, which, ironically, brought an additional crack in the relationship between it and its Spanish colonies, because suddenly Spain ended its century-old trade embargo with Britain. Spanish-American ports opened for British ships, and British cities opened for Spanish-American goods, and the profits kept piling up as a result. As a result of that, the merchants and elites of the Spanish Americas started asking questions over why this embargo had been in place in the first place, if it would return at the end of the war, and how much more they could make if they had sovereignty over their own trade policies as colonies, or maybe as sovereign states. The Napoleonic War in Spain, or Peninsular War, was an exceptionally savage, cruel and brutal war, a conflict that left 1 million dead, and the Spanish nation in smouldering ruins. The treasury was empty and the nation was in debt. The administration and power of the Spanish state had collapsed. The once so mighty and feared Spanish army had been humbled and crushed by the French. The war had in the end been won by guerrillas and a British expedition of Scottish and Irish troops. Spain was left weak, wounded, broke, and battered. And in this moment of weakness, the Spanish restricted trade with Britain again, angering the elites of the Spanish Americas, and then decided to squeeze even more out of their colonies, which angered them even more. Adding to that, the post-war Spanish government formed a parliament called the Cortes and demanded the introduction of a parliament in a constitutional monarchy with an end to all special privileges, an end to slavery, and the abolition of all special privileges in a feudal society, something that was unacceptable to the colonial elites. It would, however, be untrue to frame the revolution that followed as a revolution of colonial elites only. Spain intended to restrict the power of the Catholic Church in New Spain, forcing Spanish bishops upon the people, while local American priests swelled in the lower ranks amongst the poor, who increasingly preached against the power of the Spanish crown in religious affairs in the Americas throughout the lower classes. Spain had exiled the Jesuits from its colonies, who ran most of the educational institutions, thereby attempting to seize control of New Spain's educational institutions. And in the north, a people and society who had already much autonomy and who became increasingly known as the Norteños, and who didn't like being told what to do by Mexico City in the first place, wanted to be told even less by a far-away Madrid that now sought out to gain control over their lives. The revolution that broke out in 1810 is a complex and fascinating story, one which would burst the frames of this video and which I hope we shall instead cover in a video about Mexican history specifically one day in the future. What you need to know for this video is that it was an incredibly savage war, a war of burning towns, pillaged lands and massacres. The 11-year-long war for Mexican independence was more brutal and vicious than any of the other American wars for independence. It left 500,000 people dead, which is almost as much as the victims of all other American wars for independence combined. The Spanish were desperate to not let go of one of their most important, if not the most important colony in the Americas, and consequently fought this war with an attitude of either achieving total victory or burning the country to the ground, which, as they increasingly lost, they increasingly did. The Mexico that was born out of this in 1821 was not a republic but an empire, a monarchy governed by the former colonial elites who saw themselves as the legitimate rulers of an enormous empire stretching from the Bay of San Francisco to the jungles of Panama. But this was also a Mexico that was weak, in ruins, broken, unstable, and absolutely not in any position to enforce any of these claims. The people living in those lands as well as outside would take advantage of that. The newly independent Gran Colombia persuaded Panama to join its federation, and when the former Spanish provinces of Central America declared themselves independent as the Federal Republic of Central America, Mexico invaded and occupied the place, but could never really establish full control over it. Within 2 years of independence, the Mexican monarchy collapsed, a republic was born, and Central America became the Central American Republic again, which however itself was just as unstable and eventually fell apart as outsiders took advantage of it, but that is a story that deserves its own video, eventually. The newly independent Mexican Republic was ruled by a succession of mediocre and increasingly less qualified sets of authoritarian generals, veterans of the War of Independence, and by and large interested in maintaining their own wealth and power. Politics in Mexico, as well as how political power in Mexico was exercised and perceived, developed very differently from the United States. In the newly formed United States, politicians were increasingly beholden to their electorate as public servants. In contrast to that, politics in the Mexican republics of the 1800s, which were in the end mostly military juntas and dictatorships, was about securing your own power and interests. An elitist club reserved for society's elites to squeeze what they could out of the country. The economic structures that developed out of this were also vastly different. In the United States, the economic structure that developed was an inclusive and open one, a capitalist system in which anyone could open business and do business on their own terms. The economic structure of Mexico were an exclusionary capitalism, and its institutions reserved for a select few people at the top of society. You went into Mexican politics as a wealthy man to secure your assets and not for the good of the community or country. Mexico became the kind of country where the governor of a state happened to also own the largest mining complex in the state. His uncle owned the largest ranch estates of the state. His brother was appointed the chief justice of the state. His cousin was appointed the state chief of police, and his business partners became the various ministers of the state. A kleptocratic state structure where personal interests of ruling elites mattered the most, the legacy of which, to large extent, continues in modern Mexico to this day. Mexico, in many parts, still is a country where people go into politics not to serve their communities and country, but to enrich themselves. Not very different from the caciques of the colonial era. In fact, many of these powerful men were and are a direct inheritance of that system. And there was one part of Mexico in particular where this type of government system was increasingly unpopular: the North. The Norteños didn't like being told by Spain what to do. They didn't like being told by colonial elites what to do. And they now didn't like being told what to do by the new powerful elites of Mexico City. The Norteños lived for most self-sufficiently in their communities of ranchers and farmers stretching from California to Sonora to Texas. They had a way of life that had evolved throughout the last centuries that they wished to keep. And during the first decades of Mexican independence, the powers to be in Mexico City also ignored and neglected them. The sparsely populated lands of California were attempted to be used as a Mexican prison colony. When California governors requested funds and materials to improve the few cobblestone roads that existed, Mexico City sent them boatloads of convicts and kidnapped southern Mexicans to build those. However, since California had not the resources to control and manage such, these penal laborers tended to break free, roam the lands, plunder existing towns, and then settle out of reach of Mexican authorities. This prison labor system had developed in southern Mexico, where when the state ran out of funds for infrastructure such as roads, the government just used the army to kidnap thousands of innocent Mexicans and force them to build those projects. A system which was continued by Mexican governments way up into the early 20th century. Despite the chaos of the first decades of independence, the Mexican state had still inherited the powerful colonial government institutions of the Spanish Empire, and could therefore still enforce this in the south. But in the north, just as with the English prison colony system in Virginia, it simply didn't work. The best example of how destabilized, kleptocratic and broken Mexican governance was in the first 50 years of its existence is by following the career of Santa Anna. Santa Anna was the son of a colonial official and soldier in the Spanish army in New Spain. When the Spanish started losing the War of Mexican Independence, he switched sides and helped establish the Mexican monarchy. He became president of Mexico in 1833, but after a few days handed the presidency over to Gómez Farías, who was supposed to be acting president while real power remained with Santa Anna. Farías, however, was only president for 2 weeks, after which the presidency came back to Santa Anna, who again remained president for less than a month and then returned the presidency to Gómez Farías. The two men continued this continual exchange of the office of president for 2 years, which they did as part of schemes to enrich themselves. By 1835, the scheme fell apart and the different son of a colonial official and member of Mexico City's elites, Miguel Barragán, became president. However, Santa Anna didn't quit and became president again in 1839, 1841, 1844, 1847, and 1853. In total, he was president of Mexico 11 separate times. During his terms, he was exiled from Mexico 5 different times, presided over economic kleptocracy, over substantial losses in territory, and 2 disastrous military defeats. In total, between 1824 and 1867, Mexico had 52 presidents. None of them were elected, all were members of the country's business and military elites, all ruled through military juntas, and all spent their time in power preoccupied with trying to enrich themselves and their friends at the expense of the rest of the country. Over this period of time, Mexico lost control over large parts of the country. The once powerful government administrations of the Spanish Empire started to fall apart. The ability of the state to enforce the law decreased. Taxes could no longer be efficiently collected. Corruption was rampant. How and what laws were enforced was arbitrary and dependent on who you were and what your social status was within this society. Separatist movements emerged in Texas and Alta California that successfully split off, and several more emerged in Sonora, Baja California, Yucatan, and along the Rio Grande. The resulting revolutions, uprisings, rebellions, and civil wars, without counting wars with outsiders, killed more Mexicans than American deaths in all American wars combined, and left much of Mexico in ruins as the government sent out armies to brutally crush and burn all dissent. In simple terms, this was a mess, a complete disaster. A disaster that continued almost throughout the entire history of Mexico throughout the 19th century, made worse by a French invasion and occupation from 1861 to 1867, which further destabilized the country and eroded the institutions of the state. The Mexican Republic, to emerge out of the ashes of the war with France, was even less capable of holding it all together. The economy was by and large owned by the elites who created this mess, with no room for growth or innovation or even just economic participation in entrepreneurship by individual citizens. Mexico is in the end lucky to even still exist as a nation-state after the 19th century that it experienced, and that it didn't just fall apart completely and was absorbed by outside forces. That is not to say that those outside forces didn't try. Thank you for watching. If you don't want to miss the next part about the Mexican-American Wars, the Franco-Mexican War, and comparing the Industrial Revolution in the United States and in Mexico, make sure to subscribe. You can also support this channel and keep it running by donating to my PayPal or by becoming a patron. Don't forget to also share the video around with friends and family. Many thanks also to Tsunami Music, who made music for this video. You will find a link to her SoundCloud and social media in the description. And many thanks also to contributing artists who came forward as volunteers to contribute their artwork to this video. The Turkish artists Turkbud for making the thumbnail and Alp Mapper for making colonial scenes, the Chilean artist Flying Tank for colonial and Pueblo scenes, the American artist Echo, Jikuzen and $5 Note for the Prelude, colonial scenes and El Norte scenes, the American animator Jamie Azola for 2 great animations, the Polish artist Quadrat for a Leviathan scene, the Korean artist Teabag for redesigning the Aztec Ball and great colonial scenes, the American artist VexiSphere for North American colonial scenes and who also happens to run a Poland Ball YouTube channel, the Malaysian artist Mrs. Human Car for several colonial scenes, the Norwegian artist Pile of Trash for making almost the entire second chapter, the Mexican artist Nomad for several scenes about northern Mexico and who also runs a Poland Ball YouTube channel, and the German artist Tanit for several scenes about the First Mexican Republic. Many of these artists are open for commission or even run their own YouTube channels. If you ever want to commission art, I highly recommend you check them out. Links to all their social media are in the description. Also, many thanks to Gunter, Liberal Sanity Project, Tingly Voice and Awfull Ophelia for reading lines for this video. Links to their channels are in the description. I hope to see all of you soon again.